let's paint some Oldhammer style bases. Now, over the years, there have been many different trends in basing styles for your miniatures. I myself have always been a fan of the urban look with a black rim. Some people like to have a brown rim, and you can always have perhaps a green rim. I don't think I've seen any other colours apart from those, unless it's some sort of special base. There's always been this phrase of bases and faces make a miniature, and I myself definitely agree with the faces part, but I don't really like an overly busy base. I think it takes away from the miniature. So I think tidy bases and faces is the phrase that I would like to say myself. You might disagree, and you would be right to do so if you were right. And you have the right to do so. Nowadays, you can get your own pre-made bases. You can get resin bases with a built-in detail, and you can also make your own detailed bases and cast them yourself, so you don't have to add all that detail. But back in the day, you would have the most basic bases in the world, and these would have been known as the Goblin Green bases in the Oldhammer days, and some would argue these are the best bases. Back in the day, you wouldn't have any of this overly sculpted detail on your base. It would be a nice clean green with a yellow highlight on the top. So anyway, let's jump in and have a go at painting our own Goblin Green style Oldhammer bases. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built and painted this Oldhammer style Goblin Green looking base for your miniatures without using Goblin Green. Okay, so we haven't used many paints in this project, but the ones I have used I'm showing you here. All of the paints are Vallejo model colour, but we're using one shade from the Citadel line, and that one is Coelia Green Shade, or Coelia, or Coelia. Nobody knows how to pronounce it. So obviously, when it comes to basing your miniature, you will need a base, and for this example, I'm going to be using a 32mm base. A lot of the Oldhammer projects I do are on 25mm bases, but a 32mm base will give us a larger canvas size, as it were. Okay, so next up you're going to need an adhesive for your texture or grit. And normally I would use PVA glue, but at the moment I am testing out some Galleria, Winsor and Newton matte medium to achieve a very similar result. Also, you might have noticed I've given it a very good shake. Now I'm going to use the adhesive from inside the cap that I've just shaken up vigorously, and as you can see it does look a lot like PVA glue. So the next thing we're going to do is using an old or cheap paintbrush. I think this one came in a set from Hobbycraft and they were absolutely terrible. Apply your adhesive to the top flat part of the base and try your best not to get any of it around your rim. Now the next thing we have to do is pick our base up. I know this sounds like a simple step, but there's a little specific thing in here which will really help, and that is the use of a pair of reverse tweezers. These ones will hold on when you're letting go as opposed to pressing down, and these will make dipping things and holding things a lot easier. You can see I'm using mine to hold the base while I just tidy up the rest of my adhesive. I'm trying to be very particular about getting that adhesive right up to the edge of the flat part of the base and trying my best not to get any around my rim. We have here my finest box of grit, and this is a collection of grits and textures from around the globe. Actually, I tell a lie, it's just a collection of various grades of grits that I've bought from various hobby shops over the years. I just tip them all into one big pot for a bit of random gradage of grit. Is gradage even a word? So the next thing you're going to see me do is dunk the wet side of the base face down into that texture grit box and give it a little wiggle. It's also good to give it a little tap on the sides to remove any loose excess. If you are unfortunate enough, like I am here, to still get a bit of texture around your rim, just use your finger to smear it off. easy. Next up, we have to let that texture on the adhesive dry. So what I'm going to do is just poke my holding stick into this big pile of blue tack I have laying around for just this sort of thing. You could even just pop it off and leave it on the table to dry. That would have probably made more sense. And there you have it. After a few hours, preferably overnight, you will see that all your texture has dried. But there is one more step we do need to do before we commence the painting. To make things easier, I'm now attaching my base to a proper painting handle. And looking at this footage now, it makes me wonder if instead of those reverse pliers, we just went straight to the painting handle. For this step, we could have quite easily dunked using this. We'll probably try that next time. So for the next step, we are sealing the texture in. So we've got the adhesive back out, an old palette and some water. And my water is stored in this old Lego cup that I got from McDonald's to celebrate the release of the first Lego movie. 10 internet cookies if you can tell me what year that was released. So all we do is we mix in a little of the adhesive with the water to thin it down, and then gently dab it onto the texture on the base, creating a little puddle as it were, for it to soak in and then dry, therefore sealing the texture onto the base. Sometimes it can be a bit tricky to work out how much to put on, but if you find it's gooping down and sliding down your rim, then you've probably put too much on. There you go, you can see I have saturated my texture with the adhesive and I have no drips coming down around my rim. I'm quite happy with this. Again, we're going to leave that to dry for a few hours, again, preferably overnight, or you can be like me and use a hairdryer or a heat gun to speed things up. However, it can be a bit iffy because sometimes it will blow the texture or the adhesive off the base and create a right mess. But you can see here the texture is now nicely sealed in and we can now commence the painting. Now, as you can see, I don't have the actual Goblin Green paint. I have here Vallejo model colour light green, which is kind of close to Goblin Green. However, if you read the side of the bottle there, where all this detail is here, it says, if you're enjoying this video, then please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. That means you, Ethan. If you are enjoying the content on the channel, then please consider joining the Patreon, the link to which is in the description below or up here somewhere. I do apologise, I'm wearing a poorly fitting jumper today, or sweater I should say. The first thing we have to do is prime the base, and normally I would probably use an airbrush or a rattle can, but as this is just one small base, we're going to do it manually. So I've thinned down some Vallejo model colour black and used an old paintbrush to give it an all over coat. I like to make sure the paint is nicely thinned at this stage to make sure it seeps into all those little bits of texture. There we go, the primer on the base is now dry, and amusingly this now looks to me like a lump of coal or some miniaturized coal on a base. If I was ever to paint some coal, this is probably a very similar method to how I would do it. Anyway, let's move on. Now, as the final base colour needs to be a light green base colour, I'm going to give the base another priming coat of grey, and the colour I'm using is Vallejo Basalt Grey. I've thinned this down a fair bit to make sure again it soaks into those recesses. However, due to the black coat being underneath, I don't have to be perfect with this, and it will give me some nice little shaded areas. I'm also going to use the grey to paint as much as the rim as I can get to. Sadly, with these miniature holders, half the rim is inaccessible. So anyway, with the grey now dry, we can move on to the next stage of the base, and that is the green. Using an old big paintbrush again, we're using some Vallejo model colour light green to paint all over the base. We're going to make sure we cover all of that texture, and we're probably also going to paint as much of the rim as we can reach. But don't worry if you miss a few bits, we'll tidy that up at the end. This is our Goblin Green substitute. So the next thing we have to do is add a wash or shade to our base, and the shade we're going to use on this is the unpronounceable Coelia Green shade from the Citadel line, and we're going to give all of the top texture area a good coating of this shade. Now you want to make sure you apply it just under the edges around the rim as well. This is all part of the Oldhammer effect. Now when the shade is dry, and I mean dry, if you have any left that is wet you'll get a nasty mess, it's time to overbrush the base. Overbrushing is very similar to dry brushing, but we add a little more paint than normal. Again, the colour we're using to overbrush here is Vallejo model colour light green. This step only takes seconds and it is great fun. Again, we're going to make sure we wait for all that overbrushed stage to have dried before we move on to the next stage. Now the previous layer has dried, it's now time to start dry brushing on some yellow, and the yellow colour I'm using is Vallejo model colour flat yellow. I'm going to be a little bit more careful with my application on this stage because I still want some of that green to show through. Now as you can see, once we've applied that yellow, we have a really nice Oldhammer looking green effect going on. However, there is still a couple more steps as of yet until we complete the base. Now it's time to add a little more definition to our texture on our base. So we are going to return to our Coelia Green shade and add a dab or two of this to the top of the base. However, we're not going to use it neat, we're just going to also get a couple of brushfuls of water and mix it in to thin the wash down on the base itself. I will swirl it around and dab it around just to make sure it's mixed nicely. And with that wash stage applied, we're now going to leave the base a little while for that to dry. This normally takes around half an hour or so. Now the next thing we have to do is paint the rim. However, with the painting handle we're using at the moment, the rim is not accessible. So again, I'm going to have to swap handles. I'm taking it off my Citadel painting handle and putting it on an old paint pot with a piece of blue tack on the top. Interestingly enough, these are the painting handles I used to use before you could get your off-the-shelf variety, and they served me well for a good 20 years, I think. Okay, so next up it's time for the rimming, and we're going to return to our Vallejo model colour light green. We're going to thin this paint down a little and apply 2 or 3 even very thin coats to the edge of the base. The smoother you can get this, the nicer it looks. And when your rim is dry, your base is complete. And here we have our finished Oldhammer base without using any Goblin Green paint. Ready for all your Oldhammer miniatures to be attached to. Just make sure you don't spend too much money on eBay. So there you go, that was my tutorial on how to paint a Goblin Green looking Oldhammer style base. What did you think of that? I myself quite enjoyed painting it, and I'm looking forward to trying it a little more on some more Oldhammer miniatures. Do you think it was a close match to the Goblin Green bases? Now after looking at some real Goblin Green bases, I can see that my ones using Vallejo light green are still a little bit too vibrant, so we might have to tone it down again for a Mark II tutorial at a later date. Who knew an Oldhammer style thing could be too vibrant? Amazing! Do you think we should add flock to the top of her? Do you think we should add flock to the top of the Oldhammer style base? My answer is no. I don't like the look of flock on Oldhammer Oldhammer style bases. You can put it on your scenery or on your tabletop if you're going for the green approach, but I don't like it on the base, and I don't know why. Do you think this sort of basing would be suitable for painting some Oldhammer miniatures? And my answer is yes, that's the whole reason I did it in the first place. However, like I said before, it's still a bit vibrant and it might need a little tweaking. Tweaky. If you want to see some more painting tutorials, and I know you do, then check out the playlist up here somewhere. As always, thank you very much for watching, and always remember to drill your barrels.